All right. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm Bankole Thompson, and this is the PuLSE Institute ongoing PuLSE Literary Circle here, where we bring before you preeminent authors around the nation who have written books that are important to building a more perfect union. Just 2 weeks ago, we in fact invited Dr. Earl from Rutgers University, preeminent historian who talked to us about just Black economic subjugation. And she documented what happened in the city of Chicago during the civil rights movement and so forth. And this week, we're bringing before you a preeminent scholar on the question of race and critical race theory. At the time that the PuLSE Institute was inviting um, Professor Haney López, it coincided with President Donald Trump's executive order to end critical race theory. So this invitation was somewhat prophetic, if I can put it that way, because I think nobody in this nation knows more about critical race theory than our guest this evening, our guest speaker. Professor Haney López is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Law at the University of California in Berkeley, where he specializes on critical race theory. His latest book is titled March Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America, where he explains how the political manipulation of coded racism has evolved in the Trump era, while also offering an evidence-based approach to neutralizing political racism and building cross-racial solidarity. He has written many books. He teaches in the areas of race and constitutional law, and is the author of several books. Books such as Dog Whistle Politics, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class. He's also the author of White by Law, as well as Racism on Trial, and one of the leading voices in the nation on the question of brown or Black and brown politics. And we are honored to welcome to the PuLSE Literary Circle to give us his take on the 2020 presidential election, which is just a week or 2 weeks away. Depending how this election goes, Ian, we may wake up either thinking we are perhaps in a gilded age, or wake up thinking perhaps we just had a bad dream. But we'll allow you to do some prophecy here this evening to lay it out for us in terms of your own take about the lay of the land. So thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours. Professor Haney López, one of the nation's leading thinkers on the question of race, on the question of brown and Black politics. Thank you again for being here.
Oh, thank you all so much. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you all. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and how it is that my thinking about race has shifted dramatically over the last decade, and what this might mean. So my mother's from El Salvador, my father's white. I was born and raised in Hawaii. In Hawaii, coming of age there, I was part of this sort of undifferentiated, like mixed race population. We use the term hapa haole, just sort of mixed race. And I didn't really become Latino until I came to the mainland for college. And I first studied in St. Louis, Missouri. I'd never seen segregation so stark. I mean, I'd never it was like my introduction to the mainland. It was incredibly segregated university, an incredibly segregated city. Now, one of the things about growing up in Hawaii is we talk about race all the time. Race in terms, because there's so many different racial groups there. So we talk a lot about race, but in terms of generalities, as opposed to stereotypes, right? Like a stereotype is, this is true of every member of this group. Whereas a generality is like, hey, people are like this and people are like that. And the interplay between race and culture. So I got to St. Louis and I wanted to ask people, hey, how did this city become so segregated? Well, what happened here? And and people's reaction to me was like, shh, don't talk about race. That's rude. That's rude if you talk about race. I'm like, but wait a minute, our university is this all white space and the city's a Black city. But here we are in the suburb, and the suburbs way too. They're like, don't be racist. I'm like, wait, I'm being racist? You guys segregated this place, you know, and we can't talk about it. That's really where I became really interested, personally, but also intellectually. Well, let me say that's how I became intellectually interested in race. How I became interested personally in race is that 5 times over my academic career, I was a student at Washington University and then at Princeton and at Harvard. I was stopped by the police, you know, and sort of for being in these white spaces. Now, obviously, I'm very light. You know, so the police interactions for the most part started out really hostile, like, what are you doing here? And then between the Hawaii ID or Harvard University ID or whatever, the tensions eased. This is when I really started thinking about race, especially at Harvard Law School, where I was a student of Derek Bell. And you may know Derek Bell as one of the fathers of critical race. Okay, so, you know, and in that context, my initial interest was in understanding how race is socially constituted. We have a Derek Bell book, yes, and we are not safe.
I read this all the time.
Awesome, yeah. And also Faces at the Bottom of the Well. He's just an extraordinary intellect. Indeed, a lot of the ideas I'm going to share with you today, I presented publicly for the first time in the context of the Derek Bell lecture at NYU, the one I delivered in 2011. So, you know, to say a little bit more, I really began to think about race as something that is constituted through social practices and that is really fundamentally political, like how we think of ourselves racially. So it's a big political statement. Are we finding common cause with other people of color? Are we resisting white racism? Are we demanding justice? Are we trying to position ourselves as lighter and therefore better than other people of color? Are we trying to pass as white? If we have access to it, do we claim what is functionally a sort of honorary white status? And I say if we have access to it, I say that as someone who had access to it, right? When I was first came to the mainland for school, I was only using my father's surname. So my middle name is Fidencio after my mother's father, but my name was Ian Fidencio Haney. And with that name, what was happening, I came to understand, was that initial confusion about whether I was Latino or white or what I was being resolved in favor of this idea that I was white. And I would be white so long as I went along with that and didn't talk about race and so I changed my name and I added my mother's surname. So that's when I became Haney López. So Haney's my dad's name, López is my mother's name, as part of the Latino tradition anyway. But wow, you wanna, that turned out that was pretty easy. I was at Princeton when I did that. And I submitted a paper, first time I submitted a paper under the last name Haney López instead of just Haney. The paper came back ungraded and with the comment, is English your first language? And I went to the professor, okay, I've been getting A's my whole life. I go to the professor, I'm like, I'm sorry? And he's like, I just couldn't read your paper. It's unintelligible. I don't know. Did you learn English? When did you learn English? So I was like, oh, wow. So thinking about this, race is really political, you know. I was also really committed to a view that understood racism as fundamentally a white over non-white hierarchy. And that's really how Derek Bell understood it too, right? That this is really a hierarchy of whites over people of color. And Derek Bell would actually, he would talk about interest convergence. Is that an idea you folks have talked about? So one of the things Bell said is, he said, look, it's not enough that Blacks or people of color fight for racial justice, because whites overwhelmingly hold power in this society. And the big advances in racial justice have come when you've had agitation for racial justice on the part of people of color that corresponds to the interests of powerful segments of the white population where they see a benefit to themselves from racial justice. And his two leading examples were the end of slavery and also Brown versus Board of Education. So he says, look, the end of slavery, yeah, there's abolitionism, there's Frederick Douglass, but more than anything else, there's conflict between two economic systems, and the North doesn't want to see the spread of an economic system based on plantations, not because the North overwhelmingly is opposed to slavery, but because they can't compete economically with it. Working white families couldn't compete with the concentrated wealth of the plantation economy. And so Bell says, slavery ends not out of anti-racism. Slavery ends because it's important to significant segments of the white population that it end. And then the support of newly emancipated people in the Northern Army made it critical that slavery finally be ended in the whole country, including in the South, right? So this Bell's analysis says the same thing about Brown versus Board of Education, the civil rights movement, tremendously important, but also important that the United States was locked into a conflict with Russia, with the Soviet Union. And part of the propaganda at the time is, which is the real system that is good for working families, a capitalist system that is engaged in racist repression against African Americans throughout the South, or this Soviet system, which at the time the Soviets were opening up their universities to students from all around the world, including many students from Africa. And so now you get the United States saying, we can't lose this propaganda war. We've got to end Jim Crow, right? So Bell's analysis says interest convergence, racial justice comes not when you have a combination of Blacks pushing for racial justice and the interests of significant segments of the white community. The reason I'm laying all this out is because Bell would then go on to say, and because racism is fundamentally a hierarchy of whites over people of color, it will never really be in the interest of most whites to end racism. And the reality of that is there will be temporary peaks of progress, but racism is basically permanent. And so I think his faces at the, I think it's Faces at the Bottom of the Well, the subtitle is, the permanence of racism, right? Like it's never going to end. So that's the school that I'm coming from. That's where I was. That's how I was thinking about things. My thinking has really changed. And it's changed because I've shifted how I think about racism, the basic dynamics of racism. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I now think that racism is not fundamentally a conflict between whites and people of color. I think that racism is fundamentally a weapon of elites against all the rest of us. And when I say that, I don't mean that we're equally positioned. Whites are clearly better off. That's part of the strategy. But more than anything else, it's elites who are profiting from racism, who continue to fuel it, to fund it, to promote it in our society. That's why racism is so bad today in 2020. That's why there's so much government violence against communities of color. This is Donald Trump, right? This is the entire modern Republican Party. And I want to say this partly as analysis, right? Like here's this analytic claim. This is what happened. This is how racism worked. But more than anything else, I want to stress what this implies in terms of ending racism and in terms of coalition politics. Because if racism is a weapon against all of us, including, including against whites, that means it might just be possible to convince whites, major segments of them, 50, 60% of them, that they have their own independent interest in fighting racism against Black and brown people, right? And when I say that might just be possible to convince of that, let me say that for the last 4 years, I've been running focus groups and national surveys testing exactly that sort of a message of cross-racial solidarity as a response to a class war being waged through racial divide and conquer. And that message actually really works. Right, so this is what I'm going to say. This is what I'm going to talk about. There's a lot here. I'm going to start with some of the history, and I've actually, in order to convey these ideas, I've written a couple of books, Dog Whistle Politics and Merge Left, but I've also created a set of very short videos that I've put on a website called raceclassacademy.com. Race Class Academy, but Race Class because what I'm trying to say is racism is the principal weapon in the class war the rich are winning. And that means you can't understand racism without understanding class. And you cannot understand economic inequality without understanding racism, right? Like you can't do race separate from class, and you cannot do class separate from race, not in America. Those two are 100% fused, right? So raceclassacademy.com. So Bankole, I'm going to ask you to show video one, and then I'll say a few words about it. I'm going to show a total of 5 videos. They're all super short. And my thought is I'd say a couple words about each and then like open it up to a quick Q&A and then go on to the next to sort of develop the argument.
Let's see here.
Welcome to Race Class Academy. The goal is to explain ideas and insights that can help you work with others to build a multiracial progressive majority. Level 1, dog whistle politics. It's the main political weapon we face. I'm sorry, Bankole, I'm not sure. Sorry to interrupt, but I can barely hear it, so I'm not sure if others can hear it.
You can't hear?
No, the volume's very low.
Okay, let's see.
The previous time, corporate greed had tanked the economy and triggered the Great Depression. After that, we embraced the New Deal. We as a country understood that government must play an essential role. That's making it better. I don't know if you can turn it up even further.
Yeah, let me see.
Creating ladders of upward mobility and ensuring that economic winners pay their fair share. That's how
let me see here.
The world had ever seen. Goldwater campaigned against the New Deal, but he knew his economic agenda was unpopular, so he came up with an outrageous strategy. Here's what conservative journalist Robert Novak reported. Perhaps a majority of the party's leadership envisioned substantial political goals.
Yeah, let me see if I can. Let's see here. Okay. Can you hear this?
No, the volume's completely.
You can hear it?
No.
It's none of you can hear it?
No.
All right. Let's see. All right, let me see.
Bankole, maybe you can allow me to share screen. I might be able to play it off.
See if this works.
Okay.
Does this work?
I don't think that's working. In 1963.
You can hear it?
That worked. Welcome to Race Class Academy. The goal is to explain ideas and insights that can help you work with others to build a multiracial progressive majority. Level 1, dog whistle politics. It's the main political weapon we face, and you can trace it to this man. In 1963, Barry Goldwater and his faction within the Republican Party wanted to return the country to a time when the government mainly worked for the wealthy. the previous time, corporate greed had tanked the economy and triggered the Great Depression. After that, we embraced the New Deal. We as a country understood that government must play an essential role in regulating corporations, creating ladders of upward mobility, and ensuring that economic winners pay their fair share. That's how we grew the largest middle class the world had ever seen. Goldwater campaigned against the New Deal, but he knew his economic agenda was unpopular, so he came up with an outrageous strategy. Here's what conservative journalist Robert Novak reported. Perhaps a majority of the party's leadership envisioned substantial political gold to be mined in the racial crisis by becoming, in fact, though not in name, the white man's party. The racial crisis? That was the civil rights movement. In fact, but not in name, here's where Goldwater innovated. He would promote white supremacy, but do so using code. For instance, Goldwater would shout about law and order, as if he was talking about crime in general, rather than spreading the lie that Black civil rights protesters were violent hoodlums. This is dog whistle politics. It allows politicians to promote social hatreds, especially but not only racism, while pretending they honor equality. Goldwater would lose, but dog whistle politics won. 1964 would be the last year a Democratic candidate for president would win a majority of the white vote. Next up, racism as a weapon of the rich.
All right. Let me go to the next one.
I understand.
Well, cool. Hold on. I thought before we go to the next.
Path of becoming angrier.
That doesn't sound like me.
I know. Hold on.
That sounds like Joe Biden. So before we go to the next one, a couple of really important ideas here that I wanna highlight. One is Barry Goldwater, 1963. That's not the moment racism enters American politics. Like the white supremacy has been central to American politics since the founding of the country. It was essential to debates about how power would be allocated between the North and the South. It came back in terms of territorial expansion into the Northeast and then across the frontier in terms of policies towards Native Americans. It was relevant in terms of the decision of the country to go to war with Mexico, which itself had recently won independence from a European colonial power, and to take the northern half of Mexico. It was essential to the decision to go to war with Spain and to establish outposts of empire in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, but also in Hawaii and in Guam and in Saipan, right? So racism has always been really central to American politics. 1963 marks the year it goes underground. And it goes underground because of the success of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement and also the lessons of Nazism and genocide during World War II teach the country that open endorsements of white supremacy are evil, are immoral, are completely wrong. And that becomes impossible then at a national level in politics. Even Southern politicians start moving away from open endorsements of white supremacy. But that doesn't mean that the relative dominance of whites goes away as a political issue. It goes into code, it goes underground. That's when politicians start talking about states' rights, as Barry Goldwater would, or law and order. And on their surface, these terms are neutral, but they're designed to trigger anxiety about racism and racial position. That's what they're designed to do. So that's the second point that I really wanted to emphasize. Dog whistle politics as a term, we're hearing it more and more and more. And a lot of people are using it just to say, well, dog whistle politics is the way in which language can operate in code. That's a mistake. Don't define dog whistle politics that way. And here's why it's a mistake. When Barack Obama was talking and he said to a Black audience, we shall overcome. Fox News turned around and said, see, he's dog whistling. See, he's talking in code. That's a phrase that Black audiences understand differently than white audiences. So what? Politicians use language that is understood differently by different audiences all the time. What makes dog whistle politics a threat to all of us is that it's designed to trigger social hatreds, but to do so in code that allows people to deny that that's what they're doing. That's how we should understand dog whistle politics. So when Donald Trump talks about illegals or anarchy or protesters, law and order, or he talks about the American homeland, the heartland, the silent majority, those terms are designed to trigger social hatreds, in this case, racism, while pretending that these are just, neutral phrases that have nothing to do with race. So that's the other key idea. Questions or comments on this so far? Oh, and then 1964, just to reiterate, and we'll see what happens in 2020, but 1964 really is it's been more than 50 years. That's the last time a Democratic candidate for president won a majority of the white vote. There's been this incredible shift in American politics that's traced to the ability of the Republican Party to harness racial anxiety through coded language. And it's completely remade our politics and, frankly, our economy and the relationship between government and communities of color over the last 50 years. But we'll go on to that in a second. Questions or comments, and then we'll go on.
Hola, profesor.
Hola.
Me llamo Pamela, mucho gusto.
Hola, mucho gusto, Pamela.
This is really, I went to get your books, and the books were not in stock. The two books, Dog Whistle Politics and the Merge Left book, and I have them on order. And every book that Mr. Bankole Thompson and Miss Tina Patterson feature through the PuLSE Institute, my husband and I are going to buy the book. So we know in the earlier days, the type of coded words or dog whistle politics that they used. So President Barack Obama used "we shall overcome." What are some current words in terms of coded language that we can use to talk about a new modern day politics and politics for the African Americans and for the Latinos and the poor people?
That's such a great question. I'm going to end on like how we fight back and the sort of message that we should use. But the short answer is we need to pivot. We ourselves as progressives need to pivot from talking about racism as something that only hurts people of color to making clear that racism hurts all of us, no matter what race we think we belong to. And that the only way forward in the face of divide and conquer is to unite and build, and specifically to unite across racial lines, to build bridges between racial groups. And I say this, this is important. I say this because this message is really is key to allowing whites to see themselves as part of a multiracial coalition, but also because this sort of a message is really important. It is in fact more popular with Latinos and African Americans as well. And I want to talk about Latinos just for a second, because I just finished a major research project with how to talk to Latinos about race. I think you folks probably know, some of us think we're people of color, but most Latinos reject understanding themselves as people of color. So if you want to build a coalition with Latinos and you say, hey, we people of color need to stick together, we found you'll reach about 1 out of 4. Whereas what we found is that if instead you say, hey, powerful elites are using racism against all of us, and no matter what color or where we come from or what we look like, we need to come together, reject racism against all of us, and demand that government works for people and not corporations, that is persuasive with about 70% of Latinos, right? And so that's the pivot. And again, that message also works better with African Americans. And we can talk about it some more But the key insight is it can be tough to convince people that they are part of a subordinated group. Even Latinos, even African Americans are like hesitant to build their identity around being subordinated. It is much more possible to build people's identity and sense of self around the idea that they are part of a great majority who's being divided and who will come together to celebrate difference, reject racism, and fight for each other. It's a very positive message. It's like, I don't care what you think, I don't care what race you think you are. We are going to celebrate difference. We're going to reject racism, and we're going to fight for each other. And the key here is, this is not an evasion of race that goes colorblind, which is what Democrats always do, right? And what a lot of progressives, especially a lot of the folks who emphasize class, immediately go from class to colorblindness. Since it's a class issue, we're not going to talk about race anymore because we don't want to be, we want to ignore it. And I'm like doing the opposite. I want to talk about race all the time, but I want to talk about racism as a weapon against all of us that makes it important that we celebrate differences, build bridges across racial groups, and fight for each other. And that's the only way to take care of our own families, right? That's the sort of message. And when we get to the last video, I'll give you an example of it. But that's where we're headed.
And a quick follow-up, if I may. So we know that we have a race of people, Latinos, we have African Americans, we have poor people. Does it seem narcissistic and selfish for Black people to want to further a Black agenda? Because it seems like we're always the ones to be left out of the political process. And is it offensive to Latino people, our brothers and sisters, because they too are often left out of the process? And Bankole talks about bridging the divide. How do we bridge the divide? I know you gave that statement, how to build a coalition, but how do you build a coalition and talk about things that matter to our race versus things that matter to Latino, our brothers and sisters?
So that's such a great question too. I think the place to start is by recognizing that the only people who really benefit when we are pitted against each other, racial group against racial group, language group against language group, immigrants against citizens, the only people who really benefit are the wealthy elites. They benefit so much, or sorry, and we'll think, well, let's do, let me go back to Barry Goldwater, because this will illustrate exactly what their strategy is. The United States went through the Great Depression, right? And it was like a shattering experience, very high unemployment. A lot of people lost their homes. The environment was mismanaged. You had the Dust Bowl. I mean, it's like, I don't know, sounds vaguely familiar. But out of that experience, what whites learned was that the only way they could stand up to the power of concentrated wealth, right? The tycoons, the robber barons who ran government before, was by joining together to act collectively. And that collective action could be unions, or it could be through democracy, acting collectively to elect politicians who would fight for them. That was the New Deal lesson. Now, that lesson ended up creating government programs that taxed the rich and made them pay their fair share and distributed wealth to everybody, regulated the economy so that people could form unions, so that people were protected from consumer fraud, so they had safe workplaces. And it also pushed government to create routes of upward mobility that included education, but also included home ownership and also skills training, right? That government created the largest expansion of the middle class the world had ever seen. Those were the glory years of the United States. To a large extent, African Americans, Latinos, and women were on the margins of that expansion. But even so, those groups too did far better under the New Deal approach to government than they had under the previous approach, which tolerated both concentrated wealth and racism and lynchings and patriarchy. The New Deal coalition starting, so people think, yeah, the New Deal coalition begins to depend on votes from people of color as early as the late 1930s and early 1940s. And even if you think, I don't know if Democrats begin to win with support from African Americans. John F. Kennedy wins because of support from Latinos, the Viva Kennedy campaigns, right? There is this coalition of working whites, working class whites, coastal liberals, and people of color that is supporting government that regulates the rich. That was Barry Goldwater's enemy. He wanted government to work for the rich and not to regulate the rich and not to work for working Americans. What was his strategy? Break solidarity between different groups. The insight of the powerful few is they can only control the democracy if they shatter social solidarity. That's what they've been investing in for 50 years. That's what we risk contributing to when we ourselves engage in zero-sum politics. When we ourselves say, I'm all about my community and only my community, we're actually doing the work of the plutocracy. When we say, I will fight for my group, but no others, and the Chicano Power Movement did this too, right? They said, dentro de la raza todo, fuera de la raza nada, right? For my people, everything, for anybody else, nothing. That's actually the work of the plutocrats, because then we fight each other. It becomes like this competition, this black-brown competition. When we're fighting each other, they're laughing all the way to the bank. And so just as a practical matter, the Black community cannot fundamentally help itself if it only fights for the Black community. The Latino community cannot fundamentally help itself if it only fights for the Latino community. And for the Latino community, it's even more extreme because there is no Latino community, right? At the level of like political organizing, we're super fragmented. You've got 25%, 20 to 25% who are probably going to support Trump. How are we going to build power when we're so fragmented? The only way any of us can take care of our own families is by recognizing that fragmentation is what the plutocrats seek. Their main strategy is divide and conquer. Our only way forward is unite and build. And I think that's what was so powerful about this summer's movement for Black Lives protests, were that they were multiracial and that they were taking place in all sorts of towns and cities and suburbs. And also I think that the movement for Black Lives now is really self-consciously multiracial in its organizing and in its policies and its agenda. And that is, I think, it has to be. That is the only way forward.
Sir.
Gracias.
Sir.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Chief Rowley. From the city of Inkster. I've got a question in reference to that. I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. But one of the things that I see as a barrier to a lot of this is, what about the gatekeepers? Bankole talks about some of the gatekeepers we have in our communities, whether they be Latino, whether they be Black. We have gatekeepers that no longer understand that, big things need to happen. It's always like we're waiting, or not we, but some of them are being more subservient to those that may be in power, instead of recognizing that, hey, we need change. Hey, and it's not change just to say, okay, change for Black, but it needs. I look at everything as a change for the whole. What's good for the whole? What's good for the body? And I look at, so what do we do, about gatekeepers? Because I've had the luxury of working in different areas, and I see these gatekeepers that get in the way of progress. I see these gatekeepers that, that cannot, as we say, think outside the box, and they're detrimental to where we want to go and what you're talking about. And because where we want to go is where you want to go. and that is have a coalition of what is best for us all, not just Black, not just like Latino, not just Asian, not just Muslim, and our key is we have to get some of these gatekeepers out of the way, and some of them, unfortunately, we put them in the way because we vote for them. We get up there in some of these areas, and I'll use Detroit as an example, because somebody has known them in Detroit for so long. Okay, that's our man or that's our woman. But when you look at what is actually happening, nothing is happening. It's a stalemate. It is, it's like somebody said, well, I'm from here. Well, from here to me means nothing if you don't bring anything to the game. And I see a lot of that. Oh, he's from Detroit. He's from Inkster. He's from whatever. Well, I don't really care where you're from. I'm looking at what substance do you bring to the table to move us forward and get away from past, going backwards, really, pretty much going backwards, and not really wanting to challenge the status quo and whatnot. I mean, don't get me wrong. I believe in moving forward. I believe in there's no one politician that is 100% right. I get it, and I don't look for perfection in no human being, but I do look for those that recognize that we must have change, and we must not keep asking someone in power, is it all right to change? So what do we do about these gatekeepers?
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Thank you, Chief Riley. I think that's a great question.
Yeah, and that's William Riley. He's the police chief for the city of Inkster.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's the right question. I think that, look, we as people need to look at our leaders and say, who is leading us in the direction we want to go? And then we also need to say who's not. And among those who are not, we need to make a decision about whether they can change. And if they can change, what is required? What do we have to do to change them? Or if not, then we got to make sure that they're not in power, right? And I actually just saw, just a really beautiful spot from the Sunrise Movement, which is all of these young folks really pushing hard on climate change. And I have to say, I've worked with them. I just really admire them, because what they're saying is climate collapse is coming. It's coming fast. We can't do politics as usual. We've got to save our planet. And now in this piece that I saw this morning, they said, and Republicans are never going to change. And I wish they'd gone on to say, because they're bankrolled by the big petrochemical polluters and they can't, but okay, they're never going to change. And then Sunrise says, Democrats, they will change because we have power. And it wasn't a sort of like, Democrats love trees message. It was a Democrats can, we can exercise power over them, right? And I thought it was a very pragmatic, if we want to see change, we have to push that change. And I guess the other thing I'd say is I really highlight the more than race, more than climate, more than gender or religion, the one word I would highlight is power. Who has power? What are they doing with power? What do they want power for? And even within our communities, we have people who want power for themselves. That's a problem. We need to support people who want power to help others and who want to push power outward, who want more people to have power, more people to act for themselves, right? And I think that that's the lens where when we look around and say, who should we elect? Who should we support? How do we influence them? It's about their power, what they're doing with it, and our power when we act collectively and what we're doing with our power. So that's the number one lens that I would urge. I want to ask Bankole to show that second video, because I think to me it really connects up with how racism is a class weapon. And yeah, let's do that. Oops, can't hear it.
Okay. Can you hear it?
Nope.
Okay, let's do this there. All right, let me see here. Can you hear that? You can. Hold on. So let's. No.
That's getting better.
Not just becoming president.
There you go.
But using dog whistle politics.
Let's start again.
All right, great.
He got his start in politics, stumping for Barry Goldwater, and then he went on to achieve Goldwater's dream. Not just becoming president, but using dog whistle politics to help society's wealthy. Majorities still wanted government to regulate corporations, build ladders of upward mobility, and ensure that the rich paid their fair share. So how to make this sort of liberal government the enemy? Like Goldwater, Reagan would use racial stories. He railed against welfare queens, ripping off the system. He aimed with this to trigger racist stereotypes that framed people of color as lazy and larcenous. But he also wanted voters to hate liberal government, in this case for supposedly wasteful giveaways paid for by our taxes. Let's call this dog whistle's scarcity script, except that resources are scarce and blame government for giving to supposedly undeserving people of color while taxing supposedly hardworking whites. Reagan also repeatedly complained about government doing more for criminals than for crime victims. Call this the threat script. Fear people of color and hate government for coddling them while not protecting whites. We often think of dog whistle politics as exclusively about race, but it is also centrally about demonizing liberal government. Stripped of the code, here's the basic dog whistle story. 1, fear and resent people of color. And so 2, hate liberal government. And 3, trust the marketplace. Trusting the supposed freedom of the marketplace is what remains when you see government as threatening and fear your neighbors. Now, let's be clear. The top 1%, they don't hate government. Rather, they want to run it for themselves. The economic consequences of this are devastating. Indeed, the real source of scarcity in our lives. But up next, what happens to communities of color when dog whistle politicians run government? In other words, the real threat story.
Awesome. So here, what I really want to emphasize, like a lot of people talk about Donald Trump, like, he's, oh, his law and order and his attacks on Black Lives Matter, like it's just about race, right? That it's only about racism. And the same thing with Ronald Reagan there. People will point to him saying welfare queen, and they'll be like, that's just race. And it's really important to understand, yeah, it's race, but it's race as a way to attack government, right? It's way to, and in fact, so you'll need to help me with this. But it seems to me this is also the history of Michigan, and that you folks have been living this, right? That Michigan politics has been organized around a state level politics around white politicians talking about Detroit and talking about, you know, urban people, kind of using these scare stories and then getting elected. But they don't turn around and get elected and then really develop the state and spend a lot of money. They do the opposite. They say government's the real enemy in your life. Government's the enemy in your life because it helps the urban people. Government's the enemy of your life because it wastes money on job programs or wastes money on after-school programs. Cut taxes, cut government, cut funding. And I think that when we think about Flint and the water crisis, or we think about the cutting off of funding, or the efforts by the Detroit legislature or the Michigan legislature to put so many cities into receivership, like government can't be trusted, cut those folks off. But meanwhile, Michigan has some of the highest levels of income inequality in the nation. Some of the wealthiest counties in the country are in Michigan. And part of why are they so wealthy? Because they're not contributing to help the rest of Michigan. They're siphoning wealth from the rest of Michigan, right? And so that's this combination that that's really important to get people to see. The right uses scare stories about people of color as either dangerous or as undeserving, not only to whip up racial hysteria, but to turn people against the idea that government should actually invest in all of us, right? And again, the New Deal idea that government should invest in people, that was really popular. That built the middle class. That built Michigan, right? Those were the boom years for Michigan. How did they undo all of that? They didn't undo it through stories about economics. They undid it through stories about race, right? And so that's the, and I don't know if you all know, there's a group called We the People in Michigan.
Yeah, there's a grassroots organization, several of them. We the People is one of them. But I want to ask you this question though, and maybe you can help answer it. So in Detroit, we have a strong Latino population. In Southwest Detroit, it's in fact almost a city within a city itself. So when we talk about Black and brown politics, you know, that's where, you know, the question of brown politics comes out of, you know, we draw legitimacy from that. And then of course, statewide, Grand Rapids also has a very strong Latino population as well, which is 3 hours away from Detroit. The question I want to ask you though here is, even though we talk about the abandonment of the right in terms of, you know, getting involved in the issues, you know, relating to underprivileged, you know, as far as Black and brown and all of that, but there's also democratic inaction, you know, within even democratic leadership. I'll give you a quick example. Right now in Detroit, there's a big issue related to tax foreclosures. It was discovered, the newspaper that I'm associated with, the Detroit News, where I'm a columnist, did a very important investigative story where they found out that between 2010 and 2016, Detroit homeowners were overtaxed by $600 million, overtaxed. And they said that is just a conservative estimate, which means it could increase, right? And this is a big issue because Detroit also has the distinction of being one of the largest poverty cities in the nation. In fact, it was only a few months ago, it went down by less than 0.5%. Cleveland now leads the nation, and Detroit is second largest poverty city. So $600 million overtaxation of Detroit homeowners, that includes Latino residents, Southwest Detroit, you name it. So the PuLSE Institute launched this series of public policy forums to really push the issue. And it got the attention of the administration, the mayor himself. In fact, the mayor's office issued a statement saying that, you know, the mayor was not invited to take part in the forum. And the PuLSE Institute, we responded and said, the mayor doesn't have to be invited. He can come and sit down and listen to what people who are upset that they're overtaxed, what they're saying. So we were planning a series of forums, and we actually were planning on a national tax justice symposium. And we were going to invite Sister Simone Campbell, who's the leader of the Nuns on the Bus. She sits on the PuLSE Institute National Advisory Panel. She was going to be the keynote speaker. And so COVID hit. But before that forum, where I'm getting at with my question for you is that before the forums we were organizing, I reached out to Christine Craig, who is a Democratic leader in Lansing. She's a white female out of Farmington here. And I asked her to be on the panel because I felt like Detroit is the largest Democratic base. This is where they get the most votes. That's why Senator Harris was here this weekend. So if in fact this city is facing this level of inequality, the Democratic legislature or Democratic leaders in Lansing should be able to convene to try to find an answer, because $600 million overtaxation does implicate, you're a lawyer, does implicate the role of the tax tribunal. You know, there are a whole lot of set of conversation with that. So I sent an invitation to Christine Craig, the Democratic floor leader in Lansing. She ducked my invitation, said she wasn't available, and was asking if I wanted another state rep. I said, no, I invited you because you are the Democratic leader and we need your voice on this. And that was the last time I got another email from her. So for those of us who are in the middle of this fight, we're seeing it, you know. And so when I write columns criticizing Democratic inaction, they say, well, they're upset, like, well, you know, well, I said, well, I criticize Republicans, but when we have Democratic leaders that are not going to bat on these inequality issues for Black and brown people, I mean, what does it say about what we need to do?
She will respond to pressure from her constituency, which means that you need to reach her constituency and before you can reach her. And I think that that's, you know, that Art Reyes and We the People, I think that what he's trying to do, and I was part of the initial board, you know, we're trying to help set up We the People. What Reyes is trying to do is say to people, hey, working class whites in Michigan, stop voting in terms of your race. Start voting in terms of common cause with other people in Michigan. And likewise, we as progressives have to switch our language from Black and brown solidarity to Black, brown, and white. Right? We really need to create a movement that says to whites, you will be better off when you join with us. And if you have a leader in your jurisdiction who won't make common cause with Detroit, she's actually sacrificing you to the same sort of ruling agenda that makes sure your schools aren't paid for, that there's lousy water in your community, that your communities risk going bankrupt, right? Like there's a dream of a Michigan in which white, Black, and brown fight for each other and elect politicians who actually work for working families and not for economic elites in, I don't know, whatever those counties are where it's just all the rich people who aren't paying taxes, right? Right. So that has to be you can't go to I'm just guessing that her jurisdiction is overwhelmingly white.
Oh, it is white. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
You can't go to a political leader of a white jurisdiction and say, hey, you need to stand with Black and brown people, because she's going to turn around and she's like, actually, my job is to run as far away as I can from Black and brown people. That's how I'm getting elected, right? And so Democrats themselves have participated in the way Democrats have responded to the racial fear mongering of Republicans is if they're in white jurisdictions, they imitate it. That's how Bill Clinton won, right? And so you need to create the sort of, we all need to create, so I don't mean to put it on like you folks, right. But like the progressive movement needs to build a working class solidarity that is super race conscious, because it is precisely racial division that breaks working class movements, right? And so I'd say We the People. The other group I really like is this group called People's Action. They're a national group and they have local affiliates, but People's Action is all about like, we can't take care of rural America unless we reject racial division and start believing in cross-racial solidarity, white, Black, and brown, right? And so I think that's the message we have to move towards. And so the way I would approach that representative in the future is I would approach her through a letter writing campaign by her own constituents who say, what happens in Detroit is happening here. This is an issue for Michigan, and not just not an issue that divides along lines of race, right? To really build that working class, race conscious movement.
Do we have any question for Professor López?
And I want to actually go on and show the
Sure.
next video too, because I think the next video really gets to the issue of mass incarceration. And
less than 120.
So that's video, 1.3.
Okay, let me.
And just to repeat, these are all available online. So if you go to raceclassacademy.com, there's a set of videos there. You can watch them. There's discussion guides. Like, partly I organize these videos so that people could educate themselves, but also I put them together with discussion guides so that people could have groups and watch them together and talk about them with each other.
Let's see.
The world's
Can you hear it?
The States has less than 1/20 of the world's population.
Yeah, a little bit higher if you can, but
1/4 of the world's prisoners.
It's high.
And this isn't
okay.
Mass incarceration. It's racialized mass incarceration. It overwhelmingly targets Black and brown communities. It's true, policing has deep roots in racial oppression and even slavery, but there's something else going on here too. Look at this chart. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, something creates in the nation a rage to imprison. That something, dog whistle politics. For the last 50 years, politicians from both parties, mainly Republicans, but Democrats too, have been campaigning by using dog whistles about law and order, crime and crime victims, thugs, and super predators. And then they build prisons. Dog whistles don't stay on the campaign trail. They become militarized police in our neighborhoods and prisons across the land. And this isn't just a story about racialized mass incarceration. When politicians stoke fear of terrorists, they govern through mass surveillance against Muslim communities here at home and through torture and endless war against Muslims abroad. When they warn about illegal aliens, they build the machinery of mass deportation and rip families apart at the border. Here's the bottom line. Over the last 50 years, on many different fronts, the government has engaged in systematic violence against communities of color. The reason for this is not white racism in general, it's dog whistle politics in particular. This is the difference between racism as hate and racism as a strategy of the powerful. Up next, does the success of dog whistle politics mean we're a country of bigots?
So that for me,
the United States has less than 1/20 of the world's population.
Sorry, go ahead.
No worry. So I just wanted to say, you know, that video for me is just such a key idea that we might ask ourselves, hey, how did we lose so much ground after the civil rights movement, right? Like we were doing so good and we're making so much progress. And then you get politicians, Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and they're campaigning against civil rights. But that's not all they're doing. When they campaign by scaring voters about people of color as basically dangerous or people of color as basically undeserving, they govern in a way that's designed to make those lies seem true. So Richard Nixon creates a war on crime that he knew was completely bogus. And he launched that war. Police invading into communities, police kicking down doors, people being dragged off to jail. He knew it was a lie. We have some of his assistants saying, do we know it was a lie? We knew it was a lie. But it allowed us to tell scare stories about the Black community and about anti-war activists. That was Nixon's folks. Reagan pursues the same lie. Stop acting like People who use drugs are a public health problem, start acting like they're a huge public menace, build a war on crime. And when Bill Clinton decides that he's going to run, he decides he's going to imitate this Republican strategy. And Bill Clinton says, we're going to crack down on crime. Bill Clinton says, we're going to end welfare as a way of life. Well, whose way of life was it, supposedly, right? And now, simultaneously, when you get politicians who are telling stories about people of color as undeserving, they turn around and strip resources from communities of color. And that's very much what's happened. You know, I teach in the public university here in California. That is exactly what we did in California. We went from #1 in the country in terms of school systems to now we're like 47th or 48th, because partly like Ronald Reagan, but you know, when he was governor here, but then like Pete Wilson told stories about how Black and brown children are just basically criminals and can't be educated. So we tore resources away from K through 12 and now from higher education from our public university system as well, right? In order to understand, and this is one of the conversations that I think is so important with the sort of movement for Black Lives hoax, the ultimate source of violence, government violence against communities of color, is not racist police. It's politicians who are pushing the police to give effect to the lie that people of color are inherently dangerous and that the best thing to do is to remove us from society. And you see that in Black communities, but you also see that in the context of mass deportation. All of this stuff about building a wall, all this stuff about tearing children away from their families, all of it is meant to make it seem like people who are fleeing violence in their home country to try and build a better life for their kids here are actually somehow an invasion, that are rapists and murderers coming here to prey on Americans, right? That's the lie. But the consequence of that lie is government violence against communities of color. And I really emphasize that. Actually, if you put these last two videos together, here's the story I'm saying. If you want to understand class war and how the rich have won in their class war that they've been waging ever since Ronald Reagan, you got to pay attention to their rhetoric of racial division, because that's how they're winning votes. And I'm also saying, and if you want to respond to massive government violence against communities of color, you have to focus on these politicians who are using narratives of racial fear. The enemy is not white people in general. The enemy is not Amy Coopers, though Amy Coopers are out there and they're bad. Amy Cooper's did not murder George Floyd. Donald Trump, Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, they murdered George Floyd because they're the ones who promoted a politics of mass incarceration that turned the police in many of our communities fundamentally into weapons of oppression instead of officers promoting public safety. And I don't know, I'm watching Chief Riley and I'm thinking, okay, how's this gonna?
well, let me say this. I'm gonna take the editorial license though. Chief Riley is, and I don't say this as an independent progressive writer, columnist. I don't say this for many people. Chief Riley is kind of distinct in this role because he's a member of the PuLSE Institute. He's a senior fellow at the PuLSE Institute, where he's focusing on poverty and criminal justice reform. And honestly, in fact, he was featured in the Washington Post recently among the few Black police chiefs in the nation who actually are looking at this question of criminal justice reform with a more thoughtful eye. And he has rejected the use of facial recognition technology for his department. He said that even if you give him $1 million, he doesn't want it. On the other end, the city of Detroit, we have a police chief, a democratically run city, is the largest democratic city in the state. We have a police chief who is dog whistling Donald Trump. He's using words like Marxist, anarchist to criticize members of the Black Lives Matter movement, the same words that were used against Dr. King you know, Cesar Chavez against former Detroit Mayor Coleman Young, the first Black mayor. So we're seeing those things that are going on in the city right now. And to your point, and the question we keep asking is, why do democratically run cities have this massive overbearing law enforcement, and why can the mayors and the politicians of the cities rein in their police departments?
I'm really glad you asked that. When I started this research, I didn't understand how powerful these racial scare stories are in communities of color. But these same scare stories work in communities of color. I'm going to show you, Bankole, I'm going to have you play video 1.4 in just a moment, because what that's going to show you is a racial fear message that's typical of Donald Trump, and then you can watch how different racial communities respond. I think you're going to be blown away by what happens with Black and brown communities listening to that message. And then we'll come back. But, you know, so basically, there are a lot of people within Black and brown communities promoting right-wing messages. And the basic right-wing message, the number one right-wing message is fear your neighbors because they're bad people. You're on your own. If you succeed, it's because of you. And if you fail, it's your fault. That's the basic right-wing message, which is so opposed to the build bridges with your neighbors, act collectively, take care of each other. That's the progressive message. That's how we actually advance. The right-wing message, the reactionary message is fear your neighbors, full of bad people. Go buy a gun. You're on your own. Work really, really hard. And if you succeed, keep everything. And if you fail, blame only yourself. That's a message that's really great. This is like Jared Kushner's message, his latest one. It's like, you got to want to succeed. It's like, yeah, you know, it works great if you're the son of a billionaire. You know, then when you want to succeed, you do. But for the rest of us, we only succeed by working with others, right? And so, but when you look at Black and brown communities and white communities, a lot of our leaders, political leaders, church leaders, are promoting this message that our communities are full of bad people, and that you really got to protect yourself and take care of yourself and succeed on your own. That's what's really stopping us, right? Okay, so all right, let's watch this. Okay,
I asked that question because Donald Trump 4 weeks ago came out and said he really liked Detroit Police Chief James Craig. He said, I really like that guy. And I thought that's a scary thought. And when the president of the United States, someone of his standing, can say something like that.
Should be. You want to let's play that video 1.4.
All right.
Race Class Academy level.
Okay, let's see here.
One video. Race Class Academy.
Can you hear it?
Level 1, video 4, A Country of Bigots. The politicians know what they're doing when they dog whistle. Let's call it strategic racism. Racism as a conscious strategy, not simple bigotry in which people hate other groups. Obviously, dog whistle politicians may actually be bigots too, or they may reject racist hatred. Either way, dog whistling rests first and foremost on cold calculation. But what about the audiences swayed by dog whistle rhetoric? Are they bigots? To figure out how to defeat dog whistle politics, I pulled together a team of experts from a major national study. We asked thousands of people to react to a typical dog whistle message. Here it is. Now watch how different groups react, and keep in mind, above 50 is convincing. Our leaders must prioritize keeping us safe and ensuring that hardworking Americans have the freedom to prosper. Leaders who built a strong economy once can do it again after COVID-19. Taking a second look at China or illegal immigration from places overrun with drugs and criminal gangs is just common sense, and so is fully funding the police, so our communities are not threatened by people who refuse to follow our laws. We need to make sure we take care of our own people first, especially the people who politicians have cast aside for too long to cater to whatever special interest groups yell the loudest or riot in the street. Most people, including you and I, hold unconscious racist stereotypes that can be relatively easily triggered. Call this unconscious racism. But at the same time, and this is important, most of us also simultaneously believe that racism is wrong. Dog whistle politicians recognize our split minds on race and pretend to honor our anti-racist values while they do everything they can to provoke racist stereotypes and resentments. So how do we fight back? That's next level. See you soon.
So that should be one of the scariest videos, because what that's showing is the right-wing message, the right-wing racial fear and resentment story is very convincing, not just to the majority of whites, but to the majority of Latinos and African Americans as well, right? Because we can step back and say, hey, these scare stories are rooted fundamentally in racist stereotypes, but they're in code, and they're very careful to use the language of thugs and gangbangers and murderers and rapists and illegals. And I'll tell you what, a lot of Latinos say thugs, gangbangers, illegals. I know them, that's my neighbor. He's a bad one. I'm a good one. And the same thing's happening in the African American community. These stories that there are bad people and that a lot of our neighbors are bad and that we need to build walls against our neighbors, that really resonates, right? And so this is when we try and figure out, it's like, what's happening with Latinos who are supporting Trump, or what's happening with, I think, African American men supporting Trump. Part of it is these stories. People are like, am I a good one or am I a bad one? I'm a good one. Those other people are bad ones. And I think, Bankole, I don't know the Detroit police chief, but it seems to me that what you're saying is, hey, we've got local officials, local Democratic officials who campaign through the same rhetoric, that there are good people, there are deserving people, and there are bad people. And now I know that
the Detroit police chief is a favorite commentator on Fox National News. He goes on there all the time, and he used this language. He said, some of these Black Lives Matter protesters are trying to change our government as we know it. So you know what the coded language that is. So he's a favorite of Fox News.
So I want to jump quickly. We've seen how powerful this other message is. Okay, let me talk really quickly about what Democrats have done wrong, and then we're going to do that last video, which is like the messaging that works and works really well. So what have Democrats done wrong? One thing Democrats have done wrong is to say, hey, politicians who are using that sort of rhetoric are racist, and so are the people who support them. And the reason that backfires is because you've just seen that majorities of whites and Latinos and African Americans think that language is right. They believe in it. And they don't believe in it because they believe in white supremacy. They believe in it because it sounds like common sense. They're good people. They're bad people. I'm one of the good ones. I'm threatened by my bad neighbors. It just sounds like common sense to them. And if progressives say, oh, that's not common sense, that's racism, they say to themselves, I know I'm not a racist, but here's these people calling me a racist. They're the real racist. And so, I don't know if you're listening to Donald Trump and the way Donald Trump keeps trying to say, Joe Biden said I was a xenophobe. Joe Biden thinks I'm a racist. He wants to be called a racist. Let me say that again. Donald Trump wants to be called a racist and a bigot, because most people are hearing his words and thinking to themselves, that's just common sense. Of course, we should protect ourselves against terrorists and illegals and people who don't follow our laws. And what's wrong with funding the police so that they protect us from murderers and rapists, right? So that's one mistake. Now, here's another mistake, and this is in some ways even bigger because it's more typical. Democrats learned as early as 1970, don't just call out Richard Nixon as a bigot. But then they learned the wrong lesson. What they learned from there, they drew the idea that they had to stop talking about race entirely, never mention race. right? And this too, I call this the class left, because these are the people who say we should only talk about class. And it sounds like a class strategy, but really it's a racial strategy. What they're saying is, if we mention race, we end up dividing the multiracial democratic coalition we need to build. So let's never mention race. Let's talk about healthcare. Let's talk about the pandemic. Let's talk about a living wage. Let's talk about the environment, but never, ever, 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 ever mention race, right? So this is this other strategy. And here's the big problem with this strategy. The right is talking about race all the time, and it's pushing racial conflict. And, you know, I kind of, my wife loves basketball, so I always like, I don't know anything about it myself, but I've got a basketball metaphor for my wife. And she says, you know, like their best player is racial division. Our strategy can't be to leave their best player unguarded and ignore them, right? But that's the main Democratic strategy. It's like, oh, their best player is racial division. Ignore that guy. We'll concentrate on these other issues. It's like, that's not going to work, right? So you can't call them bigots, but you can't ignore racism either. And this is where we come to this race-class fusion, right? Talk about racial division as their weapon, and cross-racial solidarity is what we need to achieve so that we can make sure that government works for working families rather than for corporations, rather than for politicians who promote division. Okay, so this is going to be the last video, but this is this other message that I tested. Take a look.
Welcome to Race. Welcome to Race Class Academy.
Can you hear it?
Welcome to Race Class Academy Level 3, the Race Class Narrative. On one level, Race Class is a political messaging strategy, a way to tell a story. It's a story about racism as a weapon of the rich and how we fight back. Here are the 3 core elements. Distrust powerful elites stoking division, join together across racial lines, demand government for all. Listen for these elements in the following message. We'd come so far, but COVID-19 threatens our families, for instance, with health risks, record unemployment, and losing the businesses we worked hard to build. To overcome these challenges, we need to pull together, no matter our race or ethnicity. We've done this before and can do it again. But instead of uniting us, certain politicians make divisions worse, insulting and blaming different groups. When they divide us, they can more easily rig our government and the economy for their wealthy campaign donors. When we come together by rejecting racism against anyone, we can elect new leaders who support proven solutions that help all working families. Now, let's walk through this race-class story using the key identity questions. Who are we? We're people who embrace diversity and our commitment to each other. Who threatens us? Powerful elites using divide and conquer tactics. And our allies? Everyone who will join with us to make sure that government works for all of us. So does the race-class message convince voters? Look at the percentage of eligible voters who found this message convincing among Latinos, African Americans, and whites. Now, watch support go down with the class left colorblind approach, and also with the race left call out white racism frame. The race-class message also trounces the dog whistle racial fear message. Simply put, the race-class story is the most powerful political message available right now.
All right.
This is where I just throw the mic down. I'm out. That's the message. And I think that I want to kind of highlight 2 things that are happening here. One, I want to highlight this message works, and it works right now, right? That's what we've been testing. We've seen political groups use it in Minnesota, and it worked in Minnesota to beat back efforts to create fear against African Americans and Somali refugees in Minneapolis. Right, Minnesota had their Greater Than Fear campaign. It worked in 2018 for them. People's Action uses it. We the People use it. The Biden campaign has been slowly coming around to it. Bernie Sanders came around to it late during the primaries. He started adopting this frame. Elizabeth Warren uses this frame. This frame works right now. So that's one level. Here's the other level. I also want to say it's not just political messaging. It really is the way forward, and it creates big demands for us. For whites, it creates the demand that they actually see their own future as dependent on fighting racism against Black and brown people, and that they get their heads around the idea. I mean, yeah, most white people it has never occurred to them that racism is a threat to their own white children, and yet racism against Black and brown people is the biggest threat they face, and they got to get their heads around that. And because anti-Black, anti-brown racism is the biggest threat they face, they need to do the hard work of dealing with white privilege, of supporting reparations, of participating in building bridges to Black and brown communities. And at the same time, racial justice folks need to create space for that multiracial movement. And I say this having come out of the racial justice movement. A lot of our perspective is shaped by the idea that we can't trust white allies, and that we really are on our own. And yet we can't build the political power to end government violence against communities of color, or to make sure that government is pulled out of the hands of the corporations without large numbers of white allies, right? So whites need to see that they are equal and valued members of a new multiracial democracy that we're building, right? And so there's a lot of hard work there. There's nothing easy about this. But at the same time, I think the vision is ultimately really a hopeful one. Right? It's this hopeful vision that says, you know how we best take care of our own families? By honoring our ideals of building bridges with other people, celebrating our differences, and taking care of each other. And I honestly believe that's the society most of us would like to live in. You know, what the right is saying to us, and frankly, some people in our own communities are saying to us, is we can't have that society because too many people are dangerous and undeserving. And we've got to reject that lie and say, no, we're all deserving. And almost all of us are trying hard. Almost all of us are good people. And when we see each other and celebrate our differences, that's the best way that we can respond to the divide and conquer tactics of the few who are otherwise dragging our society over a cliff, right? So that's, right. If we're going to save ourselves, the way to do it is to honor our highest ideals.
Let me ask you this, Professor. Dr. King, in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, really went after white liberals. And he talked about the need to build a coalition with progressive whites and others beyond the traditional white establishment, this alliance you're talking about, though. My question to you, though, is given where we are right now, do you see this alliance building?
I do. And here's, so the last video in this 12 video series is, it's called The Wages of Whiteness. And it's a sort of, it's a video
the wages of sin is death. That's the scripture,
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And so, but at what point do you get people to see that? Right. So the wages of whiteness, and I talk about Martin Luther King, and I say, because King called for a poor people's movement that was multiracial. And it didn't work. It didn't happen. And so you might say to yourself, so why is 2020 different? And, you know, I'll give you a short answer, but I really encourage you to watch the video and then to think about the discussion. And it's also the epilogue in Merge Left is precisely on this question. Why might 2020 be different than 1968? And I think the short answer is the wages of whiteness have changed. In 1968, white people were basically better off defending white dominance than in joining a multiracial movement. They were better off because their union jobs depended on it, their access to schools, their cultural status in Hollywood, in entertainment, in sports, their representation in politics, in the military, in business. The wages of whiteness were too high in 1968 for most whites to say, okay, I'm not going to organize around defending whiteness. I'm instead going to organize with people of color to reform capitalism and militarism and racism, right? Exceptional white folks were willing to do that. Maybe 10%, maybe, but that's it. Now, if you look at the wages of whiteness, on a psychic level, the public face of white pride is Donald Trump. The public face of racial equality is Barack, or maybe better, Michelle Obama, right? Like the lies of anti-Black racism have been revealed much more clearly for most whites by Obama. This is a family with dignity, with integrity, that cares about, right, that embodies all the values that we say are important. Whereas the face of white pride, it embodies all of the things that we say we don't want to see in our own families, in our own children. But also the material wages of whiteness. What happened to those union jobs? Where'd they go? What happened to those good schools those kids had access to? Where'd they go? What happened to the public swimming pools that whites used to enjoy? Rather than integrate them, they filled them in. They literally filled them in, right? So, or more generally, all of the economic dislocation, all of the shifting of wealth upwards to the 0.1% over the last 50 years, and even during our pandemic, that has been engineered by politicians who have been elected through appeals to white pride. That's the real wages of whiteness. And it's not that most whites see that, but most whites can be brought to see that. Right? And I think that that's really why 2020 is different from 1968. The wages of whiteness right now, we're in a position to say to folks, let me just back up. When I say whiteness, I shouldn't just talk about white people, because whiteness is a set of ideas that, that lighter is better, that is also really attractive in African American, Latino, Asian American, Muslim American communities, that idea of lightness being better. So we're having this conversation with all Americans, saying to them, you might think that it's better for you or your own family to organize around being white or around being light. But the truth is, what you get when you do that is Donald Trump. And you get 225,000 deaths from the pandemic, and you get climate collapse, and you get a society that's full of strife and anger and violence. That's what you get. The truth is, you are better off. I don't care how white you are. I don't care how light you are. You are better off making common cause with people who are darker than you, because that's the best way to take care of your family. And all of us have to come together, whatever we think we are, whatever color we think we are, or language we speak, or immigration status. We need to come together to take care of each other and build bridges with each other, because that is the best way to take care of our own families. That's the key insight. And I think that that's the message that progressives need to be driving all the time. That we lose when we try and defend, or when we try and elevate ourselves over our neighbors, whatever basis that is. It could be gender, patriarchy, religion, accent. I don't care. When you try and elevate yourself over your neighbors and say, I deserve, but they don't, you're going to find out that your healthcare just got cut too. Whereas when you say we all deserve, we're going to take care of each other, we're going to make sure the government works for us, that's the best way that we can protect ourselves.
So how do you fight back? Just two more questions here. You are in the area of critical race theory, and you have the President of the United States, the first president of the modern era, issue an executive order. Just yesterday evening, I was reading a report from Reuters, just wrote a story saying the State Department, the Office of the White House Office of Budget Management has already ordered the State Department to put a hold on all diversity and inclusion trainings. They called it Un-American sessions. So what are you telling students in your class at Berkeley? And what are you, what should the response be to this? And the long-term consequence? Go ahead.
Any chance I get, I say, hey, you want to understand critical race theory? You should watch the raceclassacademy.com. Because, right, and I say, you know, I mean, so I've identified as a critical race theorist and been working in critical race theory since the late 80s. I'm getting much more traction now in 2020. Thank you, Donald Trump, right? Because, and this is partly what I'm trying to say, you know, if Donald Trump says something is bad, a lot of people turn around and say, that's got to be some good, powerful stuff. How do I find out about it? Right? And it's like that. Donald Trump, and this is what I'm saying about what Donald Trump is teaching people about whiteness. When people look to and see Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is saying to them implicitly, way to take care of yourself is to circle the wagons against bad people and to celebrate being one of the hardworking ones and to celebrate not being from a shithole country and being, you know, a great and da 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 da. People look at that and say, that man is full of ugliness and hatred. That's probably the wrong lesson. I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't take whatever vaccine he promotes. I shouldn't take any of his advice on public health. And if he says critical race theory is a problem, I should probably learn about it, right? So this is our opportunity. And we've seen big shifts in terms of people's attitude towards racial equality, support for the movement for Black lives, a turn away from white pride. We need to build on that by showing people these aren't just identity questions. These are questions that go to how we organize our democracy and our economy. And we really have to recommit, fully commit to building social solidarity. And part of the way we do that is by taking seriously the lessons of critical race theory, right? And so, so again, to leverage this moment to say, hey, Donald Trump's attacking critical race theory. So don't you think maybe you should learn about it? Because it might actually be a pretty good thing.
Finally, your take on the 2020 election, the outcome, Black and Latino voters.
I think that let me make a distinction. The country will elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We will vote for them in overwhelming numbers. But will the Electoral College select Donald Trump? Will the Supreme Court select Donald Trump? Will Russia's tampering with our elections select Donald Trump? That's what we don't know. The fact that we have to make that distinction tells you where we are in the history of this country. There is no doubt from the polling and from the enthusiasm in this country that majorities of voters will elect Biden and Harris. But we don't know about whether that means an actual change in who occupies the White House, right? And I say that that's the scary truth. Like, I know what's going to happen in terms of the numbers. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of the Electoral College or the court, especially the Supreme Court, or the hacking of voting machines or voting outcomes on the state level. But this is why, you know, we just need to push as hard as we can, and not just in the next 8 days, but I think we're going to have to push as hard as we can in the next 8 days and all the way through until a new president is inaugurated and occupies the White House and brings back, until the levers of government are back in the hands of people who actually believe in democracy and believe in democratic institutions like voting. Because and that's the risk to us. That's the risk. We've seen what happens in North Carolina. We've seen what happens in Wisconsin when majorities speak, but people continue to exercise power over government who don't actually believe in democracy. We're going to face that as a nation right now. So we need to, you know, I simultaneously believe in the American people. We will elect Biden and Harris. Overwhelming majorities of us will vote for them. But I will not rest until people who believe in democracy are once again in charge of our government.
All right. You know, Professor Ian Haney López, while you were talking, I was thinking, I'm glad that somehow we had a miracle. Your voice was able to carry you through this entire this entire session. And I'm sure that Derek Bell, the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School, is smiling from the grave because you have taken up an important assignment in terms of where Derek Bell left it. Critical race theory is so important, and this is such an important dialogue, and it's at the forefront of our quest for racial justice. You know, Bell calls it the elusive quest for racial justice, and we continue to have that challenge. So I want to thank you on behalf of the PuLSE Institute for definitely keynoting this edition of our literary circle here and for making the time to talk to us, because this is such a fascinating conversation here at the PuLSE Institute. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
All right.
And thank you for organizing this. Take care, everybody.
No doubt. Thank you so much. Ian Haney López is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Law at the University of California Berkeley, where he specializes in critical race theories. For those of you who tuned in, thank you so much for being here, and we'll talk to you another time. And that will be it.
Thank you all.
Great. Thank you.